clears? Okay, perfect. Despite Andy's introduction, this is the main event this afternoon. I thought up some other guy that might have won a Rugby World Cup. But just in case, I've got my replacement lanyard here. I'll put on a little bit later. I'm going to thank my panelists. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a little bit, but in terms of what we're going to discuss this afternoon, we're going to dive into really how can we optimize, how can we gain efficiencies, particularly how we communicate those. Definitely in a world of tightening budgets, which is something we're going to touch upon, to really get the very best out of our security processes and our technology. My CEO and chairman's here somewhere, and it's something he asks me all the time. Can you do more with less? And that's something we're going to dive down very much into. Gartner, in their 2025 trends and predictions for cybersecurity, stated that one of their top trends is going to be the optimization of cybersecurity technologies. We also have the concept of minimum viable technologies or platforms, where we need to look at actually what is it that we need what is the minimum that we need, rather than going off and chasing the unicorn. What is the minimum we need to be successful? As I say, that's all against the backdrop of some economic challenges, but also changing sentiments at board level. So before we jump into our panel discussion, I'll just ask from left to right, or right to left, should I say, from where you're looking, for our panelists to introduce themselves. TG, we'll start with you.
Thank you. So my name is Singham. I'm a solutions engineer. Been with Trellix just over 7 years, looking after central government and local government. It's my remit.
And Reg?
Hello everybody, I'm Reg Green from Telesure, heading up the GRC space. Part of the furniture, been there for close to 25 years.
Excellent. I'd say part of the foundations, the furniture at 25 years. I'm foundations, furniture at 12, you're definitely foundations at 25 years. Hayden, lastly?
Yes, I'm CI GFA, but we've had a recent change. So if you guys have heard of Massive, probably not, but we've kind of consolidated a number of companies under Massive, so my role's also changed, so I'm kind of across the enterprise now, but not as CIO, but more on the ERP and all the infrastructure side of it, more a CTO type role. And been with them for 4 years now. Previous to that, not in telco, but in financial services, probably for about 20 years.
Brilliant. So like I said, as you see, we've got quite a wide variance of experience that I hope we're going to generate some exciting and interesting conversations. So I think probably the best place to start if we're talking about optimization is one of those drivers for optimization, and that is security budgets. There's a lot of talk, particularly from analysts, saying that cybersecurity budgets are coming under pressure. They're either not growing or not growing anywhere near the same rate, particularly when you include inflation, which is putting pressure on organizations, particularly on security teams, to be able to deliver what they're doing, as I say, doing more for less, or at least doing the same for what the budgets they're getting. But I suppose my first question, and I'll start with you, Reg, if that's okay. Is that something that you're seeing? Are you finding it that there's more of a challenge around the budget? Do you see it's shrinking, or it's staying the same, or growing at a slower rate, or completely the opposite of what the analysts are saying? Because I know that some organisations I talk to, they say, Josh, that doesn't ring true for us. And I think they're probably few and far between. But it'd be great to start getting sort of the panel's experience and viewpoint on what's really happening with cybersecurity budgets.
Richard, it's a great question. So what you find is generally it's expected that your cybersecurity budget should be 12 to 15% of your IT budget. But sitting at the bottom end of Africa, yes, Africa, and procuring in rands, things that are dollar-based, ROE fluctuations definitely impact your ability to wisely and accurately predict and spend your budget. So that's typically your first problem. And then secondly, inflationary pressures. My year-on-year budget is increased on the South African inflationary model, whereas your vendor suppliers and service providers typically add 10 to 15% increases. So it does provide a challenge.
Yeah, which that's quite quite interesting. I suppose, are you feeling that pressure to be able to even just maintain the status quo?
100%. Even keeping the lights on budget is always at risk.
Yeah. And I was coming on to yourself, and I suppose I'm going to extend the question a little bit. So I'd love to get your view on how budgets, you're seeing budgets being affected. And I'd say we'll start there, and I'll jump into the next bit afterwards.
Yes, I mean, pretty similar to what you said. I think that question on doing more with less comes up continually. I think there is definite pressure on trying to get more out of what you have. But I think on the other side of that is that the risks are increasing. And so how do you balance those two, right? So as much as you've been squeezed on the one side of budgets, the reality is the risks are increasing. So unless you have a story that you can tell the board which says, this is what the risk looks like, this is our coverage, this is what we are seeing in terms of events in the environment, this is what we're seeing in terms of our vulnerabilities, and therefore we need to cover them off. What is your risk appetite? If we were to be hacked, right? What is the risk appetite in terms of your brand reputation in terms of this, right? And start doing some different calculations around cybersecurity, and then start talking budgets. And I think that's the most important thing, because if you just bring numbers, nothing's cheap, right? Licenses are stupidly expensive for all the good reasons that you mentioned, right? And that's one of our challenges. But you have to be able to sell and then talk budgets. And then every quarter, when you're actually presenting that to the board, you have to show progress. You have to show that you're actually closing the vulnerabilities because of the tools you put in place. And so you build up a story where people are seeing benefit for the spend and not just a deep black hole that is going into it. Because the challenge for security is unless you've had a breach, right, it kind of feels like a black hole. Everything's running smoothly, we fine, whatever, right? Why are you spending $20 million? So you have to try to turn that around.
Yeah, and that's almost like you predicted my question. And that one is, I didn't share it before we jumped in there. So what I was going to ask is, very similar, sort of, the threats are increasing, but budgets are staying the same or becoming more challenging. But I suppose there's also a challenge, and TJ, I might come to you because get your sort of perspective. There's also a challenge that we can't just maintain the status quo, because we've got to address not just new threats, but if you look at relatively recently moving to the cloud, so there's a whole new set of tools, and no one's been in a position, or no one I've spoken to anyway, has been in a position where they go, great, we're going to migrate to the cloud on Friday and then turn everything else off on Monday, and then we've got all that spend that we can use. Because we've got basically a whole other raft of skills that we need, a whole other raft of technologies, and how can we wrap a service internally, externally.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've seen that kind of develop.
I have. I like to use the use case. It's very interesting where we talk about the budgets. It's a really, really hot topic right now. See, I want to just show you the example. One of the universities in the UK, they've not been investing in a lot. They were hit. And a lot of the researchers' documents been encrypted, and it took them 12 months to recover. And I went to see them after this just to understand what's going on, kind of thing. And then they revealed that they've actually allocated 4 more resources to be deployed as part of the cybersecurity team. So you should really want to invest that before you get hit, rather than after. It's almost like breaking into the house, and after that you put the alarms on. So it's a very, very, very tight budget, but I think you can see geopolitical playing a part in the attacks, as you guys are talking about, increasing. So therefore, I think I see a trend where they are increasing the budgets towards the cybersecurity controls and the personnel.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier, and I think there's nothing that loosens the purse strings like a breach that's occurred. But obviously, everything we need to do is to make sure that we're well ahead of that. I suppose, Hayden, you started talking about it, but Reg, I might just get kind of your opinion, because communicating the risk and communicating the challenges is key to getting buy-in. Have you got any kind of advice on how you would approach that? And I suppose really, Hayden, you talked about understanding all of those metrics. You can't just blindly feed them up, because you've got execs that may not be cybersecurity experts. but also too much information, too much information, and not fully kind of bought into it. Have you got any advice, or what's your view on how best to tackle that?
Well, it would be like approaching any problem. You need to fully understand your landscape, your protect surface, so to speak, and map those to your risks. Because that will give you the understanding of what is required, or what is priority to protect. And you could also give a representation to your C-suite and above as to where you're going to be spending the budget. And further to that, you can also then start playing the ROI card back at it. So we've invested in this technology. To date, it's protected us against potential losses or penalties, fines, and breaches.
You talk about that sort of ROI, and one of the things that's thrown around quite often, I think we saw it on. Actually, if we go back to Ahmed's talk from Sentinel-1, and he kind of mentioned in his talk some stats on organisations not realising the benefits of AI. But Hayden, if I come to you, on this. Do you see that AI is going to have a material impact on the efficiency of your cybersecurity teams, that's going to have any impact on budgets or overall effectiveness?
Yeah, it's quite a deep question. I think the promise of AI sits here, and the reality of AI right now sits here, right? So I don't think there's any board report that doesn't have something about AI in it, right? And that's the challenge. The problem with that is nobody really understands it. It's just a great buzzword. And like all the buzzwords of the past, right? Time's one as well. But the big thing is that it's here to stay. There's a lot of value, but it needs to be embedded, and it needs to be, how can I say, it needs to be well tested within the environment you're using it, right? So as much as we're doing a lot on AI, I'm not building AI capability into cybersecurity. But what I am doing is I'm looking for tools that have AI embedded in them that the vendor is responsible for to ensure that the output is correct. So,
I mean, I suppose that's very true, like being able to manage that risk,
right.
And I suppose offloading it to a certain extent.
So it does create efficiency, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I want to be responsible for it.
Yeah, no, indeed.
So I'm wrong by it.
From a vendor perspective.
That's where we come in, where leveraging the Trellix Wise, which is the AI capability. I mean, just to give you another example, that I went to visit one of the oil and gas company, and looking at the security operations center monitoring dashboard, it's got 11 billion events. How do you tackle that 11 billion? How do you know which one to ignore, which one to look into? What about the false positive? All of this. So this is where the AI comes in, to doing the heavy lifting, and then bringing the actionable information onto the dashboard. So there's no alerts being missed. Everything's been kind of scanned through, making sure that you're not missing anything, and then bringing them actionable information onto the dashboard. And then guiding the analyst to be able to say, here are the thousands of alerts that we think there are some events in there, but here's the ones that you need to focus, and then guiding the analyst to be able to take an action to remediate. And then root cause analysis is very, very key to understand, so that you can actually close any of the gaps that you may have, that you can close them.
John, 11 million, or how many was events? And
11 billion.
11 million, and the good point there was getting it down to 1,000,
Yeah.
which I think even that's an impossible number to be able to deal with.
There's no human can do that, right? How many people that you would need? So without that support, there's no way you can't ignore it.
No, indeed. That reminds me of just that example I gave this morning of one of our incidents we responded to, where all the tools, but everything was just going off to an inbox. There was too much noise and not being able to deal with it. So, Reg, I think, so let's think about, actually, if we're talking about looking to optimise security operations, particularly without sacrificing that protection, because that's going to be the challenge. Where do you think, or where would you advise to really start looking at approaching that, to be able to gain, to optimise, to gain that advantage?
Again, probably a difficult question to answer, and every environment will be different, and every approach will be different. But I think it stems back to getting the right partner involved, and it will be your commercial partner, but not a supplier. It must become a partner. And over and above that is really stretching your investment, because all of these things are expensive. And you need to stretch it to the point where you derive more value from it than the input that's gone to it.
And would you say that we're kind of at that point where it's not something you can do alone? You can't. You have to partner, and you have to look at how you can share that burden.
Definitely, and it's not about always sharing the burden. It's about bringing not the best knowledge of your organization and team, but bringing the best knowledge of the industry. Gives you the advantage, because if you think about your organization, it's almost ring-fenced. It's a small pond. Whereas if you look to best knowledge in industry, they've seen this before. They've had exposure to this where you haven't and your team hasn't. But it's important to upskill your team as well. And that's where the partnership for me comes from. And be very prudent and wise in selecting your partner. You don't want somebody that just drops a box or drops a product or mails you a key. Yeah. It's really somebody that's climbing into bed with you. That's how intimate it should be.
Yeah. Well, we'll move on from that, because we're not going on tangent there. So I wouldn't mind just starting to talk about the cloud. If I could just come to you, Hayden. And I think the cloud has always promised great efficiencies, promised great cost saving. Haven't really materialised unless you're hyperscaling your applications up and down in an elastic manner. But they also add a lot of complexity. I think if we talk about some of those challenges in terms of being able to secure the cloud, it's different products adding in different costs. But how do you kind of see how organisations can kind of strike the right balance between kind of that agility that the cloud gives you, but actually the control? And do you find that actually that it is putting the right controls in place around that to manage the expectations or manage the ambitions of development teams and cloud teams beyond?
Yeah, I suppose what comes down to risk and budget, right? So, I mean, there was a time when everybody was like, let's just shift everything to the cloud, right? And everything was on-prem, let's go to the cloud. And the promise was more compute for less spend. Now there's a trend which is going, well, I can buy that compute a lot cheaper, so why don't I just go to the cloud where they're charging me more and I have to manage it, right? But there's also a bunch of managed services around the cloud that you then miss, right? Which you have to build teams for to manage, and they're not necessarily skilled up to do that. Then there's a trend of everybody going into SaaS, where it's not even in your control anymore, it's sitting somewhere else. It doesn't mean you don't need to know and understand what the risks are around that, or what the security controls are around that. So we're moving to a big SaaS-based set of platforms, right? We're consolidating everything. And we're moving a lot of on-prem to cloud, but in different ways. So it depends on the workload, it depends on the risk. But I mean, even on our SaaS vendors, we hold their feet to the fire and they have to prove to us what security they've got in place, what redundancy they've got in place. I want to see their audit reports. So it becomes a different way of managing. But it's really important not to think, I've put it there, it's now safe, I can forget about it. Yes, I mean, we've got workloads running in different environments. And it really depends on what it is. It comes down to risk and cost. And scalability. It depends what you need. And I mean, one of those things is, we talk about Elastic, right? And that's great, Elastic's brilliant, but it costs. But that's also where AI comes into it, right? So I had a discussion with Microsoft yesterday, with the Irish team, and I was going, that's great, pay-as-you-go is wonderful, if you can give me the AI to manage my workloads without me having to manage it myself. So you give me the AI around it, and then I can manage my cost.
And what was the answer?
Nothing. so it's all great and well saying, yeah, you can manage it because you've got a great pay-as-you-go program. Again, it's really expensive on CSP. And I'm going, but give me the AI so I can manage the trends that's happening within my environments, and then give me CPU when I want it, new VMs when I want it, whatever. Just bring them up as and when, based on the trends. Do you trust your AI to do that for me? And the answer was a flat, we'll come back to you. Yeah. So the opportunities there, I think we will get there, but it's something that is not necessarily happening today. It's going to be over the next couple of years. So AI is definitely going to play a factor. It's definitely going to be an opportunity to run in the cloud more optimally. But as you know, I mean, coming out of financial services, you know, the trend has not been to move all of those workloads that are close to your chest to the cloud. It's been keep it in your data centers, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, just on that, and I can stay with you. I mean, you sort of mentioned trust. Everyone's favourite topic in the news, obviously, Donald Trump and his war on globalisation. But is that also factoring in, which kind of flies in the face of optimisation, you know, particularly from a cost perspective? Does that factor in terms of actually who can you trust now, particularly where data resides? We had Martin Petrov from our team talking about different data standards, which actually, you know, we go off on a whole tangent of actually the implications of holding data in lots of different places. You know, you've got data controls that need to, or data regulations that you need to adhere to, you know, multiplying that by a factor. Before I go down that rabbit hole, yeah, does that factor in to decisions, you know, particularly as you move to the cloud, particularly as you take up a lot of SaaS applications? Does that factor in at all as part of that decision-making process, or have we not got that far yet?
So I think it always factored in terms of cost. It depends on where it's sitting in Europe, the US, or wherever. So it always factored in terms of cost. But I think the Trump conversation has become interesting because it's kind of like a left field conversation, which wasn't there before. And I'm not sure how important or not important it is. So I think some of it's a lot of hype. I think some of it's just commercial positioning from the part of Trump himself. And one of the questions that we have had is, if there is a challenge in the US putting embargoes on anything, right? In Europe, if they're not singing his tune or whatever, what redundancy do we have in South Africa? So it's interesting because we run a big Salesforce setup. And my question to Salesforce was, yeah, great. So we're sitting in London, we're sitting in France, we're sitting in, I'm trying to think where else, in Sweden on Salesforce. And I said, that's all great. Beyond the Trump question is, what if we have a problem with undersea cables like we had last year, right? And the question to Salesforce was, when are you going to put your Salesforce workloads in Cape Town and AWS, because they're on AWS. And the challenge with that was, not because we're not consuming a lot, right? I mean, Standard Bank and everybody's running big Salesforce workloads. The challenge is they take South Africa as a conglomerate, they throw it into their global pot, and they say, we're not big enough to give you Salesforce instance sitting in Cape Town.
Wow.
And so you kind of fighting against thunder. So what do you do? And I mean, we've taken it as far as we can. You can stand back, and it's like, sorry guys, we're putting one in South Station.
Yeah. Well, TJ, if I can come to you. I mean, as I said at the very start, one of Gartner's top trends, one of those sort of, well, spoke about that minimum viable product, but also how do we optimize technology. And one of those sort of optimizations we see is around technology. A lot of the time it's because we've got technology products that are overlapping, particularly with vendors making acquisitions. I suppose it's something that actually, particularly with the history of Trellix, is very relevant. How do you kind of see that? Yeah, because there's also a question of eggs in multiple baskets. Yeah. So, kind of, what's your view and take on that? How should organisations be looking at optimising their vendor portfolio? You know, and one of those other stats we saw was, you know, on average, organisations have 40 to 50 tools in place from 10 different vendors. There's got to be a need and a drive to reduce that. You know, what's sort of a vendor perspective?
Yeah, so there are two things for me. The first one being the platform approach, right? You can't have a siloed solutions. When you have a siloed solution, you need to have too many resources, too many consoles. That creates a massive headache. You know, when you have, and when you design your solution, you want to make sure that you are covering all of it, and then assuming that you're going to get hit. So I'm closing all the gaps. So therefore, the platform approach that kind of gives you sharing the threat intelligence. So when I say two things that is important for me is that you want to be proactive. So a lot of the companies, I mean, look at what happened to Marks and Spencer's, look at what happened to Harrods, Co-op Group. All of these, you need to be proactive you want to be able to track to see what the campaigns are out there, and then you want to be able to look to see where the active campaigns, which country they are prevalent, what sectors they're actually looking into, and then also you can actually map it to your environment to say, in the event of any one of those campaigns coming into your environment, do I have the sufficient? So you're looking at the security posture. So you're being proactively staying ahead of the game. So having that platform approach, proactive threat hunting, having that visibility, I think it kind of gives you a greater protection. That's what I see from the vendor perspective.
Yeah. And Brent, if I can come to you on sort of a similar question to get kind of, I suppose, an end user point of view to sort of to compare against the vendor view. How are you approaching, and do you see it as a challenge of too many vendors? We need to consolidate down, or do you see it too much of a risk to put eggs in one basket? I suppose it's how about balancing that.
100% right. And to Andy's point as well, now you have data and services all over the world. So contract and contractual management becomes a nightmare. But one has to guard against concentrating too much, because you're creating a concentration risk. We've seen a couple of months ago where a specific vendor went out, and it affected airlines, and half of the world was down in with no other alternative, because the investment was in a single pane of glass, single platform. So it's all about a balancing act, and maybe don't have too many silos, but definitely have a split, a logical split somewhere. Have a backup plan at least. If one fails, you almost have a catch rail or a net on the other side.
Yeah. And that actually, sorry, were you going to come
No,
on that?
yeah, this is where I like to talk about having the layered approach. Your first defense, and if you miss that first defense, at least you've got a second defense to give you the mean time to detect and mean time to respond. So I think it's a good point, having that.
It is. And I suppose conversely to that, we were chatting outside, and actually I suppose about the increased appetite to accept risk, and kind of how you're seeing that in terms of, that as long as we've done the right things, then we can accept that there's going to be a bit of a challenge, like you sort of mentioned DR earlier. It'd be great if you can just bring some of those insights of actually how you're seeing that sort of changing attitude to, because we talk about layering up and putting multiple lines of defence in, but that's not always the case, and actually that's not always the drive, particularly to balance budgets.
Yes, so two things. I mean, not really a cybersecurity question, but can I just add to the initial question first? So on this one, I mean, we're consolidating technologies right now across the group, and the way that we're doing it is we're going, well, we take an approach of saying, what do we actually require? What is the components we require? What are the technologies that supply that? And we're looking at from different aspects of cybersecurity, and within this space, what is the component view? Right? What is my requirement? And then having a look at the technologies around it. And as much as we talk platform sometimes scares me, right? Because everybody's trying to be everything to everybody. And that becomes a challenge sometimes. Everybody's got an AI component in security these days. How good is it actually? Questionable, right? So I'm not also spewing the best of breed either. But what I am saying, get fit for purpose, because that's also got a cost factor associated, right? And make sure it works well for you within the requirements that you have. I think that's kind of the point. On the other piece, we were talking about how the risk postures are changing. And I think it's very much driven by numbers. And the economy is really tight. I think globally the economy is really tight. The big IT spends, there's a lot of pressure on it. There's questions going, but we spent so much on cybersecurity over the past 3 years, and you still want to spend, right? Haven't we kind of secured it yet? So the discussion around all the additional threats that are coming out of such comes to the fore. But we were talking about redundancy, DR, etc. And the question now becomes, previously it was, if I have a critical system, it has to have backup, it has to have high availability, and it has to have DR. And I have to have network availability across multiple links as well. And now it's coming to the question of, okay,